Hello, friends. Welcome. Welcome to FCNL's National Network Call, Persistent Advocacy in the Face of Disappointment. I'm Bridget Moix. I'm General Secretary. I have the honor of serving FCNL in this role and the joy of being with you all this evening tonight to talk about our advocacy, where we've been, and what's ahead. And maybe you were looking at that sign at the beginning, that image, the quote from John Lewis, reflecting on John Lewis's legacy from the anniversary of his passing just this past week. That quote, "Democracy is not a state, it is an act." And just take a moment to reflect on what that means for you, why you're here, why we've gathered, and the actions that we're here to take together. That quote is a favorite of mine, and it's right around the corner in my neighborhood in a neighbor's house, and I walk by it and get inspired every day to keep up advocacy in the spirit of John Lewis. So thank you all for being here tonight. We are in a continuing time of challenge and a continuing time of need for our persistent advocacy. And we also know that many of you, like us, may be feeling disappointed, maybe feeling tired, maybe feeling angry, maybe feeling really upset and uncertain about what we can really do to make a difference. So we're here tonight to gather in that space, recognizing that this work we do together is hard. These times are challenging, and to find inspiration together, to build community, and to inspire one another to take action and to keep on keeping on in these next steps that we'll take. So we will be having a conversation that I'm really looking forward to with wonderful people on the FCNL staff and from our network. I'll be speaking in the first part of our conversation with FCNL's Associate General Secretary for Policy and Advocacy, Amelia Kegan, who we know will inspire us to keep on, and also with FCNL's Legislative Director for Domestic Policy, Anika Forrest, who always grounds and centers us for the importance of the work that we have. We're going to talk about the political moment that we're in. We know we have lots of questions. You have lots of questions. We'll have time for those. We want to talk about the impact that our collective advocacy can and does have, and also look ahead to what's next, particularly with the August recess coming up, and what are the actions that we can take together and in our homes and districts. And we'll hear more about that from Justin Hurdle, who leads FCNL's grassroots efforts and is going to equip us with actions and next steps for the way ahead. So really looking forward to this conversation, and also we'll be having some input from some other special guests along the way from our network. And before we start and dive into all that we want to discuss, just a few technical reminders that we always want to make sure that we do. And I want to particularly welcome new folks. We know there are some new people on this call who might be joining us for the first time. Thank you for being here. These are our large network calls. So we always try to remind folks how we can have this conversation together well. And one thing is that live captioning should be available to everyone if you're joining on the computer or by tablet, so you can use that if that is helpful. We will be closing that chat box. Go ahead and keep putting your introductions into it for a couple more minutes. We're thrilled to see 306 people on the call at this point. That's what my screen says. So welcome to you all. But we will then close the chat box during our conversation so that we can all center and listen to the conversation together. And you can still direct chats and questions to us, to the panelists, or tech issues to us. But we will ask you to submit your questions through that little question box. So that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen is the place to go if you have a question that you want to submit. And please do send in those questions along the way as we're in conversation. We will collect them. We will try to answer as many of them as we can. And they are always very helpful for making sure that we address the issues that you want to hear about. So Thank you so much for being here with us. And let's turn to our conversation with Amelia and Anika. So, Amelia and Anika, wow, it's been a tough time. This has not been an easy few months. We're only 6 months or so into this year in this administration, and it seems relentless. We've put in a lot of hard work. The work that you all, our staff and our network, have been doing over the last months has been incredible and intense. And yet it can sometimes feel like it's not making a difference. We're seeing votes go through, we're seeing legislation pass that is very, very harmful to people around our world and around our country. We're seeing continued acts of authoritarianism, illegal acts from this administration that are threatening the lives of many people. We have an ongoing horrific situation in the Middle East, continued wars and conflict around the world. And there is such a desire and energy by so many people around this country to stop the injustice, help turn the country around, do what we need to do to get back on track. And yet we can feel overwhelmed by everything that's coming at us. So just in terms of the latest legislative action, let's talk about this big, horrible bill that we worked really, really hard on for months and that has now passed Congress. So, Amelia, can you just talk to us about what happened? You know, what efforts made a difference? What is the situation now with the bill and what's next?
Thanks, Bridget. And so grateful to everyone who has joined us this evening from all over the country. Yeah, so much work went into that, the big, beautiful Bill Act, into that legislation. You know, we did everything, right? We called on our network again and again, you all, and you responded. We had over 250 lobby visits across 42 states. One example, Representative Fitzpatrick, one of the few Republicans to vote against the bill, his office had visits from different FCNL constituents 9 times. We were on the Capitol steps at all hours of the day and night, and we were praying and preaching and postings in social media with members of Congress about the consequences of that bill. We had vigils, public witness events, there were faith leader fly-ins, there were grassroots advocacy days, right? We laid it all out there. And yet the bill passed, right? And we saw the Medicaid cuts go up to nearly $1 trillion. We didn't see the supplemental nutrition assistance program cuts mitigated. We didn't see, you know, the cuts to the climate investments stayed in. It's a huge, huge loss. And I think we need to acknowledge that and the kind of how we're all kind of sitting with that. I do want to note that there were some important areas where we did mitigate some damage. There were efforts to make the bill a lot worse, where we were able to pull some of those pieces back, and we did do a blog that kind of lists some of those, and I'll put that in the chat if you want to read through some of that. The legislation is now law, but the story of this one big, beautiful Bill Act does not end on July 4th when it was signed, right? There are two essential pieces that remain: implementation and accountability, right? We still have actually a couple years before many of the cuts go into effect, so there's some time to do some mitigation there. And then the accountability piece is really, really critical. It is essential that members of Congress know where their constituents are on this law and that they are accountable for how they voted. And there are still a lot of people who do not know what is in this law. So we have some educating to do. We have some organizing to do. We have some work to continue to build coalitions, especially with people who might not be with us on everything, but are kind of aligned on some of the concerns about the impacts of this legislation. And that's going to be critical in building power and to continue to have a stronger impact. But Anika, I'm curious to get your thoughts and reflections as well.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you definitely laid out the really responsive and committed work that so many did, particularly in our network, and we're deeply appreciative for that. And I right now the scripture keeps coming to me that we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. I couldn't think of anything more fitting that encapsulates the reality of the reconciliation bill, or even the rescission package for foreign assistance that just passed, that I know Bridget is going to touch on as well. On the migration side of things, the reality is that we have just seen a blank check for unreasoned, indiscriminate immigration enforcement that will impact generations, as $170 billion will be used to expand the federal government's enforcement machinery, including the hiring of 10,000 more immigration and customs enforcement agents and personnel. We will see the escalation of detention, particularly private detention, which has a track record of being riddled in abuses and substandard situations. We will see mass deportation apparatus in ways that are likely to tear apart families and communities in places of worship, because we see that happening already. The reality is we just passed for immigration enforcement more than what most nations have for their defense and military budgets. And we should not take that lightly or forget to push upon Congress what that means and how they need to reverse track and also ensure accountability and oversight is key. Because what we cannot allow to continue happening is threats on sensitive locations. We saw the Quaker community pretty readily step up around that. And yet there are still endless reports of congregations, of soup kitchens, of community activities seeing a decline in participation because of how our enforcement practices are happening in the country. There are church leaders who have made decisions to disband requirements and so forth in congregating for places of worship, some that didn't even do that during the pandemic, right? That shows the gravity of the current situation. We see community vitality at risk as local markets and businesses close, as agricultural sector sees more rampant and widespread raids, which will ultimately disrupt and impact the American food supply chain, at a time where we've already heightened it by saying children and families don't deserve food, right? And so we see these issues are really building on top of each other. And it's all a part of a scheme in terms of how we perpetuate the sense of belonging, right? And we see that it was never really about coming the right way or who is of quote unquote legal status, because we see stripping of people who did have status. So a practice of undocumenting, as you would say. We see a deportation first, ask questions later, policy being implemented by the administration. We see really deep entanglement with our military practices, from the deployment in LA to borders having military personnel there, to efforts to retrofit military bases, and the list goes on. We see the imprisonment of folks for exercising their First Amendment rights, which is not attached to any sort of status, but solely that you are on American grounds. And I'm listing some of this to remind us like what we are pushing against, that just the fact that the bill passed does not mean that the conversation is over, as Amelia has laid out. Oversight and accountability are going to be crucial and key. Right now, we have over 400 facilities and prisons in the US that are used for detention, and we would be seeing that escalate for family detention. We talked about private detention for military bases, the list goes on. We could see more rapid soft sites, like the alligator Alcatraz that is just completely unconscionable that has been created in Florida. And so we need to ensure that our members of Congress are not allowing that to happen without reason, as it is now. And so a lot of the work is to ensure that rife and dangerous abuses that exasperate overcrowding in detention facilities, that would allow fast-track deportations without due process, that would shortcut the process for contracts to happen for some of these private detention groups, don't happen. I've been heartened to see legislators across the country, from Colorado to Texas to Florida, showing up to exercise their codified responsibility in oversight. And they've been experiencing challenges, and they've been loud and vocal about that. They are not often able to get into facilities, which is outright infringement in terms of what their oversight responsibilities are. And it also shows how the rules keep changing. Just like with the undocumenting of people, we see even for members of Congress, the rules keep changing. That shows the lack of good faith in this conversation that is happening when we talk about immigration enforcement right now by the Trump administration. But if we've learned anything, it's that the president doesn't actually have an unlimited mandate like he thinks. And we have to ensure that Congress makes that clear. So we can, we should, and we will be holding Congress accountable in the months, weeks, years ahead. And a big part of that is doing that in community with folks like on this call. When faith leaders, when people of conscience, when people of moral backgrounds speak out, we know that is heard. It may not seem like it. You may feel like you are in an echo chamber, but we know that couldn't be further from the truth when we are on the Hill and talking to members of Congress across the aisle. And so part of what I'm asking folks is, when it's August and your members of Congress are back home, to be showing up and visiting offices and doing visits and going to town halls, and making sure your voice is heard and that they know you are watching, and that you are holding them to what they are tasked to do.
Thank you so much, both of you. It's hard to hold the magnitude of everything that's happening and also continue to act. And yet we've seen again and again, as you both said, that our network keeps stepping up, and it is so encouraging for us. And I really want to just underline the role of the faith community and working with our faith colleagues over the last months and how important that has been. I really do feel like we're at a time when we need to practice faith over fear, and that will be part of what carries us through together. And we also have all the issues here in this country, and then all the issues still around the world. And we know our advocacy teams, our advocacy core young adult organizers have been very focused this year on the situation in Gaza, on looking at how to get aid moving again, how to get a ceasefire, how to get just and lasting peace for all people. And that situation still feels so bleak. We actually had a visit today to our office from colleagues connected with the Friends School in Ramallah. That was just incredibly moving to hear, how difficult the situation is there. And yet they, for instance, have lost USAID funding that went to that school, and they're struggling to get it back and figure out what's going on. And we've seen Congress pass a rescissions package, as you mentioned, that really seems to just let go of Congress's power of the purse, constitutional authority, that money that Congress appropriates should be spent, and that Congress has this power. We've seen the dismantling of foreign aid and of USAID in a way that it's hard to know what the future looks like for the US's role in the world. So we have so much happening, and it feels like this Congress is not pushing back, is not stepping up to really do what needs to be done to uphold its authorities. And these foreign aid programs, as well as domestic aid programs, the loss of this funding will literally take lives. We were walking around the Senate, talking about the thousands of lives that will be lost because of these funding cuts. So how do we think now about what's next, and how can we affect the direction of some of these issues now? Is it even possible? Amelia, give us some inspiration here.
Yeah, I think it is important to sort of take a step back and look at where we've kind of been, where we've made progress, and also just recognize the really hard environment that we are in right now. So, Bridget, you were mentioning all the advocacy that we have done around the Middle East, and the number of and level at which members of Congress have spoken out about the situation of Gaza, the number of members of Congress who have signed on to and supported the joint resolutions of disapproval, the JRD, spoken out about the need for unfettered aid to Gaza, that has continued to grow and grow and have become so much stronger since our work began on such an incredibly difficult issue. And then when we think about where we were 6 months ago, we had this new president coming in. having a lot of talk about this mandate blowing into office with this whirlwind of chaos. I think back to February and March when Doge was sort of ending nearly all of foreign aid programs. It was so hard to get anyone to really, particularly members of Congress, to speak up, Republican members of Congress, to speak up and push back publicly in any sort of big way. And now here we are. We just went through this rescissions package where the administration is trying to claw back funding. But the level of pushback we're seeing is growing, right? More members of Congress, particularly on the Senate side, were voicing opposition to the cuts and the administration's approach on funding. The administration was forced to drop some of what was in there, such as PEPFAR and global health funding, because of the huge advocacy around those programs. So there are cracks, they are growing. We have to keep pressing. And this is where the opportunity comes in. So why the August recess is so important. Government funding runs out September 30th. So Congress needs to do something. And even if it is just extending current funding levels for a few months until they can reach an agreement on the bigger kind of spending bills, whatever they do needs 60 votes in the Senate. So they will have to have bipartisan support to pass this. And the big question is, will there be guardrails or some sort form of assurance that the administration will adhere to what Congress passes? This is a big question, and it's going to consume a lot of September. So August is the time to lay that groundwork, to press for the importance of funding for foreign aid, but also asserting Congress's power of the purse. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good reminder to remember that our voices are making a difference. It's so hard to see some of that impact, but it's really helpful to just remind ourselves that we have made a difference in a number of ways. And as you say, there are cracks in this, and we can open those ways more. And at the same time, sometimes it feels like the whole system feels dysfunctional. And Anika, your work on migration justice right now and everything you laid out earlier on the call about what we're up against feels really heavy. Can you talk about, have you been seeing advocacy making a difference in the migration space? What can people be doing?
Yeah, it's definitely been challenging, and it's easy to feel like you make half a step forward and get thrown a block back with how things are moving in the migration world right now. Amelia pointed to some of them which feel small in the grander scheme of everything that was in the reconciliation bill, but are really significant. There were efforts to raise asylum application fees to $1,000, something that would have been greatly prohibitive for most folks to seek asylum. Seeing that drop down to $100 doesn't completely eliminate that barrier, but it does mean in the limited ways that asylum does exist right now, because I want to be clear about that we are not by any means honoring the right to asylum as a nation, but it does mean for those who are able to seek asylum right now that it will be more feasible and doable. The same holds true for U.S. citizen children who were at really high risk of losing their right to their family getting the child tax credit. And while that didn't fix in a perfect way, we are able to ensure that more children will be able to have it, even if they do have one parent who might be undocumented or without a social security number. The ways in which I think advocacy is really standing out is not always on the Hill right now. And so I think it's the strength of the movement and of people of faith really making their voice heard. When we are coming against the powers that face us right now, they do not come down easily or swiftly or quickly, but they do come down when we are strong and firm and relentless. And so that is what I am taking a lot of confidence in. When you see communities rallying to get the release of people who have been unjustly detained, and sometimes those folks are indeed released, that is a hope and inspiration and a signal to what we can achieve at the federal level as well, if we all truly coalesce. So when we're thinking about what advocacy happens going forward, There's a lot to do on the reconciliation front, as we talked about, but there's also a lot of other issues that have maybe not gotten as much of the headline focus that are equally devastating and tragic. And part of that is when we're looking at our refugee admissions program, which is so inextricably connected to the foreign assistance conversation, because the funding that is for human security, that is for education, good governance, shelter, medical and health assistance, anti-poverty, the list goes on. The fundings that help to ensure that people are not forced into involuntary migration, that they aren't in conditions that rise to persecution and torture, we have largely dismantled that. At the same time, completely freezing our refugee admissions program, with the exception of a few caveats. Since day one, that has occurred. And we have also seen the termination and suspension of refugee resettlement. So we functionally do not have what was one of the quote unquote gold standard programs of legal humanitarian immigration in the US, which takes me back to the point earlier in the call that we know this has never been about the right way in terms of how you come to the US, but it has always been about exclusion and xenophobic practices. And we are really looking to be pushing Congress in the coming months and weeks to restore our refugee admissions program and to fund those programs and to get guardrails for them. And I can imagine that some might say, why would we be asking for funding right now when we know they just keep cutting it and the administration is doing other things? And the reality is, we cannot concede to or endorse their suspensions, their disruptions, the list goes on. We cannot allow that to be the norm. And they have to know that people are watching and people are pushing back. And so our asks are pretty simple: reopen and fully fund the US refugee admissions program, reinstate and safeguard funding for refugee resettlement, and protect and increase that funding and foreign aid and humanitarian assistance program going forward.
Thank you. And it's a good reminder that funding things through Congress actually impacts lives a lot. And there have been, as was mentioned, some programs, some efforts to restore or protect funding have succeeded. So we actually know that we can help save lives, we can help protect people, we can help push back, as you're saying, against this sort of authoritarian takeover by this really focused advocacy around the issues that are moving through Congress. And we've been through to lots of protests. We're going to need the continuing mobilization of people in many, many different ways. But I was in a conversation today with someone talking about the reality of authoritarianism that we're all feeling and the appreciation he had for FCNL's work to keep doing that work around what's moving through Congress, what can people really advocate in a strategic way on to try to make a difference. So we have the August recess coming up. We have these opportunities. Amelia, you mentioned foreign aid. What explicitly should people be doing on foreign aid in addition to the migration issues that Anika's been speaking about?
Well, Anika said it, right? It is kind of the funding for robustly funding foreign aid as this appropriations process goes moving forward, and also kind of making sure that Congress asserts its constitutional authority of the power of the purse and really holding the administration in check when it tries to infringe upon that. And as I said, September, critical month. A lot of decisions are going to come down of what's going to happen there. So this is a key moment for people to really weigh in with their members of Congress and prepping them and letting your members of Congress know where you stand on that, and that the funding decisions are so important, and that the accountability piece of there is so important. I just want to mention, you were talking about the importance of this moment in our work. And I was fortunate. I heard from Maya Wiley last week, who she's the heads up the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which has this really powerful history. And she spoke a bit about how it is hard to feel the power that we all have in the midst of so much chaos. And she was reminding us that we really have to remind ourselves of our power, right? Collectively, we have so much power, and you should feel powerful. We have to remind ourselves of our power and help remind our friends and our neighbors and those in our communities and help feel that power as well. We cannot back down in this moment. The organizing work, the advocacy work, it is so essential right now. And as Reverend Terry Hord Owen said, she goes, this is holy work that we are doing. So I just am so grateful for you all for embarking and participating in this holy work that we are doing in this moment. And I think now I'm going to turn it over to Justin, who has a guest to share a story about some effective advocacy in North Carolina.
Hello, and thank you, Amelia. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Anika. We are going to be joined in a moment as Zoom catches up by friend Bob Lackey from North Carolina. Bob should be here in a moment. As Bob gets settled, Bob is a member of Asheville Friends Meeting in North Carolina and also serves as volunteer advocacy team's statewide coordinator in North Carolina with the FCNL advocacy teams program. So Bob, thank you for joining us. We're glad that you can share how you worked with FCNL a couple months back as part of this reconciliation budget work to amplify the voices of 50 friends across North Carolina. Do you mind telling us what you did and how did it go?
I'll be glad to. Thank you. In June, FCNL North Carolina advocacy team members brought our 3 budget request asks to our monthly meetings. And we ended up with 51 members from 4 North Carolina monthly meetings: Asheville, Swannanoa Valley, Chapel Hill, and Durham, who supported the asks. When we reached out to Senator Tillis, to the scheduler for a virtual meeting, we were told that for 3 asks, namely protecting Medicaid and SNAP in North Carolina, protecting clean energy tax credits and investments in North Carolina, and a more humane immigration policy, that we would need to schedule with 3 separate staffers and that they each did their own scheduling. We were then told by the first staffer to respond to our emails that the staffers were overwhelmed with little more than a week left leading to the budget vote. At this point, I reached out to Justin Hurdle with our quandary of how to proceed with this information. After conferring with others in the DC office, Justin wrote a revised ask from our 3 leave behinds, which Amelia Kegan would deliver to the lead staffer's office in lieu of a virtual visit. I emailed this plan to the lead staffer, expressing that we appreciated the pressure she was currently under, and told her that we were abbreviating the asks and that Amelia would drop off the revised ask. The staffer expressed her gratitude for presenting this new plan to communicate. I then emailed the 2 other staffers with this plan, and they also thanked us for the alternative communication instead of the virtual meeting. In the next few days, we learned that Senator Tillis did hear the concerns of many groups in North Carolina, including our statewide advocacy teams in our monthly meetings, urging the senator to protect Medicaid and SNAP, as well as the clean energy tax credits and investments in North Carolina. I would just like to say that the impression from the staffers that I was left with was their gratitude for us hearing how overwhelmed they were feeling and presenting them with a revised, abbreviated communication of our asks.
Thank you very much, Bob, for sharing. And I think one thing as we were considering what we wanted to bring to this, knowing that people have questions, that there's a lot of different ways to engage in advocacy. This story that Bob shared is one that, to me, fits into our theme of persistence and persistent advocacy, because persistence does not mean that you cannot be flexible with your strategies and your tactics and your approaches. As we think about the importance of relationship building, it's also being responsive to the people that you are trying to influence, that you are trying to persuade to your side. It doesn't mean that it's always going to work out in your favor, but oftentimes people are more responsive, more receptive when you're willing to try and meet them at least halfway. And one thing I think people like Amelia and Anika and lobbyists here at FCNL, as well as advocates like Bob and others on this call can tell you, is congressional staff are people too, and they are also being demonstrably overwhelmed because people are trying to make their voices heard. So I think it's a great story of how we can be flexible and still make our voices heard. As Bob and I talked earlier today, being able to get those 50 friends on this letter probably meant more people were actually able to make their voices heard than would have been able to join that lobby visit anyways. So it's a great way to make us remember that there are different tools in our toolbox. So that's one example, and we'd love to make sure that we lift up other examples. So please, if you have examples of effective advocacy or you want to collaborate on a sign-on letter like Bob's example, feel free to reach out to us at lobby@fcnl.org, and we'd love to discuss. So we talked a little bit and heard from Amelia and Anika about the importance of August recess. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but to this theme of learning from each other and hearing from the experience of advocates on this call, we wanted to highlight some advocacy tips and advice that we received when people registered for this call. So we're going to put up a slide here and highlight a few of these. Thank you, Lindsay. So we got some really wonderful advice, and I wish I could share more than these three, but we don't want to take up too much time, and we don't want to just make this a big slideshow presentation. But I think some really important reminders about the importance of never giving up, regardless of headwinds, from a friend in Nevada who's a patient advocate. A great shout out from Tracy in Wisconsin about the importance of not just being an advocate out on your own, but finding a group, whether that's an FCNL advocacy team or another local group. I know I've seen people mention Indivisible and Common Cause and some others. That ability to be sustained in your advocacy through the ups and downs is so important. And I know we have advocacy team members here on the call with us tonight. And then the third one I liked here was advocacy takes so many forms. This is from a friend in Texas. Choosing a loving attitude in every moment is advocacy, and staying present and expanding awareness of our relationships. Staying honest with our speech is advocacy, and being sincere. And now I want to highlight a few tips from folks who registered for this call as well. We heard some, again, great little tips here about sharing stories. Congressional offices, they have the numbers, they can always use the data. Even for members who might be in the minority right now, how they get those stories out to constituents, to the media is always important. Being sincere and remembering that relationships are central to this work, as we heard from Bob and Jim in Minnesota. One that I really appreciated from a North Carolina friend of thinking about what are your platforms and your opportunities that might not be very political in ways that you can connect and share opportunities with others. So this friend mentioned the platform Nextdoor, which I wasn't as familiar with. And lastly here from Joanne in Virginia, taking up the fight starts with talking to each other. We regular folks have got to start helping other regular folks understand what is going on. And I think that's a really great encapsulation of when we're frustrated with our members of Congress and their staff. Sometimes it's not about taking frustration out on others. It's about looking inward and how we can use what we know, our experiences, and share it with others to try and convince them to come along with us. Thank you, Lindsay, for sharing that slide. I wish I could share more, but we want to keep moving, talk about August recess and the opportunities, and make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers. Speaking of questions and answers, we have received a lot, both on this call in the last half hour and from plenty of you when you registered. And there's one that keeps coming up, so we wanted to address it head on. So Lindsay, if you could put up that next slide. This excuse me, we're going to talk about August recess, and then we'll talk a little bit about that question that keeps coming up. Excuse me. So for the August recess, it encapsulates the entire month of August, from the 1st all the way to Labor Day, which is September 1st this year, I believe. So what role can we play? What actions are we encouraging? We know that there are folks who can do in-person actions, are maybe near their local congressional offices. We know there are folks who, for a variety of reasons, can't make it out to in-person events or in-person actions. So we want to make sure that there's a lot of accessibility here for ways to make your voice heard. So on this in-person action side, visiting those local offices in August is going to be really critical. And you can go by yourself, you can bring a spouse, you can bring a partner, you can bring your kids. But it's really wonderful when you can bring a group of people. We had some great examples of people bringing members of their church community into lobby visits, into drop-in visits over the last few months. And it really shows that there's a group of constituents who are paying attention. It's also a wonderful opportunity to deliver personal letters, those stories that can be really useful. And finally, when you do those in-person actions, take photos, share it on social media, send it to your local newspaper to let them know that people are, again, paying attention and addressing accountability. When you share those with FCNL, we can also help amplify them and get them in front of those members of Congress. At home and virtual actions, I think there's a lot more opportunities these days than a few years ago. So ask for those virtual lobby visits. We have resources on our website that can help with that. A lot of people on this call have done that as well. People are making phone calls. Those phone calls do work. You can mix it up by doing it weekly, inviting others to call as well, amplifying these asks in the media, as well as handwritten postcards and letters. We've heard a little bit about the work calling for humanitarian aid in Gaza. There's a wonderful campaign that FCNL and some other groups are working on called Letters for Gaza. We'll put a link in the chat as well as the follow-up email about how you can get involved in that. We've heard some wonderful stories from members of Congress themselves about a resurgence in handwritten postcards and letters, making them really think deeply about these difficult issues. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about how you can be a mobilizer. If you're someone who can't get out in person, but you can think about who your network is. We'll talk a little bit about that link there at the bottom of the slide, fcnl.org/recess. That will have all of the resources you need, and it'll be linked in the follow-up email as well. Lastly, now before we move into the Q&A, we want to address that question that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Many people want to know about contacting members of Congress who do not represent them. And let us say we understand the frustration. Some of us experience that with our own members of Congress, and we talk to folks all the time about how to work through the frustration. This may be because your member is completely on board with you, or they might be in complete opposition and you're just frustrated. So let's talk about some options for what you can do in that situation. And Lindsay, can you put up that next slide? Thank you. So some suggestions from FCNL of how you can work through some of those frustrations without contacting other members that do not represent you. You should still contact your members, your representatives and senators, even if they agree with you. You don't know the behind the scenes. They are hearing from lobbyists, they are hearing from constituents, they are getting pressure from other people and other groups. So making sure to thank them and encouraging them to lobby their own colleagues is really important. Hearing positive affirmation only makes them stand up and speak out more loudly. So when you're meeting with congressional staff, for example, you can ask which members of Congress you think or they think you need to lobby or be convinced. That gives you a guide for how you can think about your network and share that information with FCNL in a way that then we can both be thinking about how we can reach those members that need to be influenced. You can also think about who you know in other districts and states. So one example of this that you can do is some of the asks that we talked about on foreign assistance and migration and refugee funding is really appropriations focused. So one thing you can do is look at who are the members of the appropriations committee and say, oh, I actually know someone who lives in that area, or know someone who lives in that state that might care about that issue. So what can you do once you start thinking about who you know in those districts and states? You can reach out, encourage them to prepare for a lobby visit. You can also join them for a lobby visit. One thing that I hadn't thought about until relatively recently was growing up. Turns out I was about 200 yards growing up from another congressional district. So it wouldn't have been difficult for my family to, go lobby the other member of Congress as long as I had a constituent with me. So if you are near another state or another district and you know people in those places that are constituents and can actually go and be heard, offer to assist them, offer to support them, be that friendly face to give them some guidance. You can encourage people in your network to connect with FCNL, connect with the local advocacy team near them. You can also work with them to write a letter to the editor. That's something that everyone can do, and FCNL has wonderful resources that can be helpful. So I know we have lots of questions that we want to get to, and I think Bridget is going to help get us through some of those questions. Lindsay, thank you for putting up our slides. And Bridget, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you for all of that helpful information and concrete ideas on what we can do. Just because it was a lot, we will be sending all this information out afterwards. So you will get follow-up information with all of this that Justin just shared. So we do have a number of questions, and I want to appreciate people who've been submitting questions, even when they registered for this event. They already had questions. And I want to just start with one that came in pretty early about educating people. And this question says, you mentioned the importance of educating people about the big budget bill or maybe other issues and the harmful effects of them. Can you share some examples of how to educate what's been successful? And I would just add to this question, particularly given how polarized everything feels. How do we educate people when sometimes it feels like people are already in their corner and it's hard to have a conversation? Amelia or Nika, either of you jump in.
Well, I think there are a variety of different ways you can go about it, right? And so I think it depends on how formal or informal you want it to be. I mean, there's always, you can gather folks together for a little session, especially to see if folks know what is, what was in the bill, or to talk about it or how it might affect them. I always find like asking questions for folks, but seeing where people are to begin with and what they care about and what their big issues are, I think is usually the starting point of what do you care about and what you know, and sharing some information. So FCNL has lots of resources that are available to help with some of that. But there are a wide variety of organizing tools that we want to be helpful for you as you are kind of sharing and trying to work with other members of your community, especially bringing people in who haven't been a part of the conversation and haven't been a part of the work. But Anika, I'm curious to hear your response.
Yeah, I think that all resonates with me. I sometimes joke like I'm a church kid, so that's where I go first sometimes. And so how places of worship can be good centers of information sharing in the community, I think is also important, because that often goes beyond the walls of that particular faith group. And so ensuring that those folks are sort of read in and plugged in, are having community awareness events is one space that I think speaks as important. There are often groups in a lot of communities that are already equipped and poised to sort of do some of this work. And so I would also say touching in with some of those groups and figuring out where awareness or know your rights calls or whatever it may be can happen or take place. Places like libraries and community centers, though some of those with funding concerns and threats have at times become less of a space where those can happen. But I think awareness is important, but I also would encourage within our sort of smarting up on what's happening and so forth, that we also think about how we can organize and move forward in terms of advocacy and our frustration and in our grief.
Thank you both. And that speaks a little bit, or leads well into a next question we received, which is about how we do some of that engaging in advocacy. And FCNL really tries to work from the grounding in our Quaker faith that, you know, there is that of the divine in every person, and we want to seek that, we want to speak to that, we want to listen for that in all of our interactions. And someone wrote in and said, it's been difficult to consistently be respectful doing advocacy with so much pain and harm in the world, which I very much understand. Then I check myself, but it's hard, they say. It reminds me of the hard work of spiritual development. What kind of daily or weekly habits do you recommend or find useful? I would love to hear, Amelia and Anika, your thoughts on this as you lobby every day with all kinds of folks. Anika, you first. Go ahead, Justin. You want to go first?
I would say I've been talking to a lot of people lately, and I want to emphasize one of the tips we highlighted earlier, or pieces of advice of finding that group that you can really sustain yourself with. And like I said, it doesn't have to be an FCNL advocacy team. It doesn't have to be a Quaker meeting or a Quaker church. It can be anything. And I think I found, excuse me, I found some really wonderfulness to help me on this with a little book club. It's been a great way to kind of disconnect a little bit while also having a group of people that isn't inherently political, but we can actually have some conversations and learn from each other of what we're doing to help sustain ourselves when these really horrible things come up. And I found it very grounding in a way that I wasn't expecting.
Thank you. Anika or Amelia, do you want to add?
Yeah, I don't know if it's so much spiritual development, but what sort of what helps me to keep constant, and I guess finding that common ground in the work in a spiritual sense, I think, is the reminder that I often get from religious spaces that I've been in, where you can have folks with a really broad range of perspectives and political ideologies, and yet for me there's something very sacred that we all find commonality in, and worship together and believe in a lot of the same principles. And so that has often reminded me about the individual in each situation, or as you know, because Quakers would say the light, right? And so even if I am seeing someone who a lot of the exterior and how they talk, or maybe the stickers on their car would put me for pause or concern or frustration, I center back in that the same creator who made me created them.
I would just add really quick. I mean, I think there's so much power in community. And when we do this work together, it is hard, but when we're in community doing it together, that is so fulfilling. I think spiritually, emotionally, like in so many ways. And so I think that is one of the things, is there is enormous purpose. And so I would say that the other piece is like, to Anika's point, having those conversations with folks who are in very different places, but on common ground on some of these bigger, like, I think there is just a lot of general agreement on some of the big issues and big concerns about the direction of our country. And so coming together on some of those, finding where there's kind of agreement, I think is also empowering and feeling not so marginalized or alone, but we are part of a bigger piece that is really trying to move what is happening.
That's a great segue into a next question. We'll do a couple more before we wrap up. someone asked, how can I approach people who are more conservative than I may be, or supportive of, the Trump administration or some of the actions that are in legislative issues, but actually might agree on some points. And I think we experience this a lot in our lobbying with Congress. So what's your advice? How to approach people that, you want to have a conversation with, get to where you can agree, but you're starting from feeling like you're, in different places?
Go ahead, Amelia.
I start with values. I think there's a lot of agreement on like basic values. We can all agree on like, and where we do it on it kind of from a faith perspective, especially in a lot of the interfaith work, is some of the central tenets of a lot of scriptures across faith traditions: to welcome the stranger, to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable, care for creation, those sorts of things. And then kind of what does that look like? And so I have found, particularly in talking about some of the legislation and when you're starting from some of those basic pieces, there's oftentimes agreement on some of those kind of pieces and then going from there. But Anika, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's an important question, right? Like, never in the history of movements that can I reflect did we have change because all the people who agreed the same thing on every point made that happen, right? You have to have a broad, strong coalition and stakeholders, and it doesn't mean that you have to work or collaborate with people in a way that feels inauthentic to you or that can feel like a threat. But it does mean stretching oneself, and being brave enough to figure out where we can move forward, where those openings exist. And so if it's someone that you already know that may not align with you on a lot of things, but there are pieces where you are, then work with that, right? You don't have to engage in the rest. Make purpose where you have that commonality. And if you don't know at all, but are just thinking, how can I approach the conversation? Think always starting with questions as opposed to preachings is a good opportunity, because the more you unpack and figure out what someone believes, why they believe it, you get to where you might have agreement, and then you can move forward from there.
Such good advice, and not always easy to follow, and yet such a good starting point to ask questions first. So appreciate that so much. Justin, one more question for you, and then a final wrap-up question, and we'll just maybe go a minute or two over if people can hang with us. The question came in, and some comments have been around protests and the importance of mobilizing, people in the street and collective action publicly. And people do that. And someone said, I do that. And I know FCNL is focused on lobbying and building relationships. Are these things in conflict? Justin, I know you answer this question a lot.
Yes, and no, I don't think they're in conflict. It's all part of the different roles that we can play. And I'll tell you, my mother is a wonderful, I don't even know if she's on this call, but she would be the first to say she is out on the street. I am going to be, leading the charge, and I am not that person. And we all have different roles to play. I'm more of someone who is okay being a little bit more behind the scenes, supporting people to take actions in the way that they feel makes a difference. And I think when we get this question, I try and make people to try and get them to think about it as an opportunity. When you're at that protest, when you're at that vigil, when you're at that rally, how are you inviting people in to, for example, FCNL's work and approach of lobbying or using the media to raise awareness or to try and influence officials? So when you're at that protest, how are you inviting people and educating them on this is a really great way to raise awareness, get public attention on this issue that we're here for, and then when it's time to, maybe have something a little quieter, when it's time to have a more intimate conversation with a congressional staffer about something really specific, maybe a very specific amendment in a bill. No one's going out to do a protest or a rally about a specific amendment. Rallies are really kind of the bigger picture thing, right? So I think when you're inviting people into lobbying, for example, it's an opportunity to share a story in a more intimate setting where you can be a little bit more vulnerable. So they're not in conflict. I think they complement each other, and they act as a funnel for people who want to engage in that, different approach to advocacy. They all have a role to play. And I think they're really a great way to build coalitions and meet people and invite them in that maybe you wouldn't have met or been able to invite in if you didn't participate. So it's important to participate in advocacy in any way that you feel is important and impactful. And then when you come back to FCNL and you're working with us on some of these really specific things, it's just a really great opportunity to invite people in. So thinking about them as complementary rather than conflicting, I think is really important.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely a both and. John Lewis certainly taught us that. And we had Reverend Senator Warnock tell us, we need the inside and the outside. And FCNL is part of both of those things really in different ways. So last question, and then we'll move to our final wrap up. This question touched me, so I wanted to share it and get people's thoughts. One of our participants says, Ann Applebaum in several news programs and interview situations has pointed out that the most difficult challenge is simply to ascertain how much simple cruelty animates this administration's actions. How do we address a concept like cruelty when it occurs in so many different situations? This immoral situation has to be addressed along with the specific political, social, military issues. And the person says, I confess I'm overwhelmed by this matter. I think a lot of us feel that. And I would just love to hear your thoughts, any of you, about how you handle that, how you advise others to manage that reality of addressing cruelty in the midst of these policy issues.
I think it's why organizations like FCNL, coming from that faith perspective, are so powerful and so necessary right now. These are moral issues, these fundamental moral issues, and no one carries that stronger than when you're coming at this from something bigger, motivated by something bigger than yourself. And people of faith and people of conscience can do that in a way that is unlike many other groups.
Thank you. Anything else to add, Anika or Justin?
Yeah, I was looking at the time, but I
Please,
can
go
jump in.
ahead.
I think for me, it's that they're intertwined, right? Like policy matters because it impacts people. From something as simple as laws and ordinances determining the day your trash is picked up to your very rights in existence, right? It is all because of that. And so when we think about cruelty, for me, it's how are the policies advancing that and how do you challenge it and what are the through lines? So even if there's one specific policy that you're uplifting, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. And so you can't do it all, but there are still ways you can speak to and elevate the intersection and interconnectedness of it all. And that's what I have found that allows it to be more manageable, but you can still be piercing in the ways that is necessary.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for the wonderful questions. We just want to wrap up with a couple announcements and appreciation and great gratitude for your spending this time with us and for doing all the work that you're doing. Please continue it. Democracy is not a state, it is an act. Please continue to take action with us. You will receive an email tomorrow with the links and the recording and all this information. And I hope you will be able to join us and others in your community in taking action during the August recess with all that information we're providing. And of course, please do help us grow our network, invite others to these calls, to join in an advocacy team, and please do continue to support us financially. We depend on your support to do this work and are so grateful for all the folks who are supporters. You can be a monthly sustainer is a wonderful way to keep your gift giving all year long. So thank you so much. Keep educating, advocating, and organizing. And we are so grateful. I'll just close with a final quote from John Lewis, just to bring it back home because he's so inspiring. This is Lauren Brownlee on our staff shared this with all of us this week. John Lewis reminded us, you are a light. You are the light. Never let anyone, any person, or any force dampen, dim, or diminish your light. Thank you, friends, for being lights.